The canticle of ash drifted quietly through the black void, a lonely sentinel suspended in the vast emptiness of space. Its metallic hull reflected the cold, indifferent light of distant stars as it cut through the expanse, gliding toward the forgotten planet of Var. Its engines, though ancient and battered, hummed with a peculiar resonance, an ominous vibration that tugged at the edge of the consciousness of every soul aboard. Magos explorator Seraphon, Vitus, stood at the helm, his augmetic eye scanning the void before him, its cybernetic lens flashing as it processed data. He was accustomed to the eerie silence of space, but today something felt different. The Vox was silent, save for a faint, rhythmic pattern, something almost like a pulse, beating through the static. It was the kind of anomaly that made even the most hardened tech priests uneasy. The first clue had come earlier that day, a sudden tremor in the ship's Auspex readings, followed by a cryptic transmission, a single word: unholy. The term was vague, yet powerful enough to seize Vitus's attention. Something was wrong. The ritual scans had yielded nothing out of the ordinary, but something was pulling them in, dragging them closer to Var 9 like a moth to the flame. Vitus wasn't one for superstition, but this was no mere malfunction. No, the canticle had been beckoned by forces far older and far more dangerous than anything he had ever encountered in his many years serving the Omnissiah. The tale of Var the Ninth was one of dust and silence, a world abandoned by all but the most forgotten of the Imperium's archivists. But it was not always so. Long ago, Var the Ninth had been home to a thriving forge world, its power unmatched by any within the sector. What had happened to it, Vitus had yet to uncover. But that was about to change. He called for a full scan of the planet, seeking any sign of the forgotten forge ship that was said to be floating in orbit. If it was still there, it might hold the answers he sought, or perhaps something far darker. The readings that came back were puzzling. A strange signature emanated from the planet's surface, something alive, or at least not entirely dead. And then, like a whisper in the back of his mind, the words from the transmission echoed once more. Unholy. The ship's Vox receiver sputtered to life, delivering a garbled transmission from an unknown source. At first, it was just noise, static and hissing, before it resolved into something far more chilling, a litany, a chant. An unfamiliar tongue, laced with an unsettling rhythm, spoke through the static. Vitus froze. It was impossible to ignore the words. Even through the distortion, they carried a resonance that struck deep within him. "By the engines we live, by the engines we die," the voice repeated. "We turn the galaxy red." Vitus turned toward the tech priest in the corner, his servitor eye twitching in response to the incoming signal. "Translate it," he ordered curtly, though he already had a sinking suspicion that the answer would not be one he was ready to hear. The servitor's augments whirred as it processed the data, its metal fingers dancing over the console. Unable to identify, incompatible with known dialects of the Omnissiah, it reported flatly. But there was something in its voice, something that betrayed its own confusion. Message, origins unknown. The thought sent a cold shiver down Vitus's spine. He looked out at the vast, empty space before them, the stars seeming to flicker ominously. Then, without warning, the planet's surface flickered to life on the auger screens. The once dead world of Var 9, now brimming with activity, its surface glowing with an eerie crimson hue. It was as if the planet itself had awakened. Vitus narrowed his eyes. His first instinct was to retreat, to abandon the mission before the unknown could reach them. But something compelled him to press on. A calling, a pull. He could feel it, somewhere deep in his augmented mind, where the machine god's voice could not quite reach. Something had stirred. He turned to the crew. "Prepare to deploy. We're going in." The engines hummed louder, resonating with the same pulse that had reached across the void. There was no turning back now. The path ahead would lead them into the heart of the unknown, into the depths of a place where the very fabric of reality seemed to unravel. As the canticle of ash descended toward the surface of Var-9, Vitus's thoughts drifted to the words of the chant, "We turn the galaxy red." A strange sense of foreboding washed over him, but there was no time for hesitation. The engines roared as the descent continued, and in the back of his mind, the litany continued to repeat, its rhythm pulsing in sync with the ship's engines. Something was waiting for them below. As the planet loomed ever closer, the thought nagged at Vitus. Was it the world that had called to them, or was it something worse? A creeping sense of unease filled the air, but in the name of the Omnissiah, he had a duty to fulfill. And so, they descended into the heart of darkness. The ship's descent was smooth, too smooth for comfort, as if Var-9 itself were willing them to land. The canticles of the Omnissiah whispered through the Vox, but there was no comfort to be found in them. Vitus sat in the cold steel chair, the flickering lights of the bridge casting long shadows over his face. His augmetic eye blinked erratically as the scan reports flooded the console, confirming what he had already sensed. The surface was alive with movement, though no conventional life could account for it. The planet's atmosphere shimmered as the canticle of ash passed through the outer layers, and as the ship neared the surface, the redness of the planet grew more distinct. It wasn't just a hue. It was a pulse, a rhythm in the air, a sensation that hung heavy and oppressive, like the heartbeat of a giant under the ground. The air grew warmer as they neared the ground, but not with the heat of a planet's natural warmth. It was a strange, artificial heat, as though the very atmosphere itself was reacting to their presence. Surface coordinates marked. The pilot's voice broke through the tension, terse and clipped. Landing in 5 minutes. Vitus nodded, his mind already calculating the most efficient deployment strategy. His tech priests would take point, followed by the security detail. He couldn't afford to waste time. He needed to know what lay beneath the surface of this cursed world. "All units, prepare for deployment," Vitus commanded. His voice was calm, but inside, he felt the unease rising like a tide. The ship shuddered slightly, and for a moment, the voice of the planet's pulse grew louder, a dissonant thrum that rattled his bones. It seemed to echo within the very structure of the canticle of ash, resonating through the hull and into the minds of those aboard. "Vox contact Magos," the communications officer called out. Vitus turned his attention to the officer's display, where static danced over the screen before resolving into a warped transmission. It was incomprehensible, a mixture of Binharic and ancient Gothic, the words twisted in unnatural ways, and yet there was a strange familiarity to the voice, something that triggered a memory within Vitus, a memory he could not quite place. Before he could give the order to trace the transmission, the ship's landing gear touched down with a jarring force, and the harsh silence of space was replaced by the distant hum of engines and the suffocating weight of atmosphere. The canticle of ash had landed, but the air outside felt wrong. It was thick, oppressive, like the very world was exhaling with a great ancient sigh. The ramp hissed open, and the first of the deployment team stepped onto the surface of Var-9. The ground beneath them was soft, but it gave off an unnatural warmth, a heat that clung to their boots. The first step felt wrong, like they were not meant to be there, like their very presence was a violation of some forgotten law. Vitus stepped down last, his augmetic eye scanning the barren landscape before him. The land stretched out in all directions, a desolate expanse of cracked, red soil and barren rock. There were no trees, no signs of life, yet the air was alive with a buzzing hum, a resonance that thrummed through the ground and into their bones. "Report, Magos," came the voice of Captain Dylis, his hand on his bolter as he surveyed the barren landscape. Vitus turned, his expression unreadable beneath his mask. "Something is wrong here," Vitus said softly, his voice heavy with a quiet dread. "This world is not as it seems. The forged ship's presence here, it is not a coincidence. Whatever waits beneath the surface of this planet, It has been waiting for us. The security detail moved forward, forming a tight perimeter as Vitus and the tech priests advanced toward the center of the landing zone. The planet's pulse seemed to grow louder with each step, a steady beat that mirrored the rhythm of their own hearts. There were no signs of the forged ship, no wreckage, no indication that any Imperial presence had ever been here, save for the faint, half-formed glyphs carved into the rock. Vitus knelt by the carvings, his gauntleted fingers tracing the jagged lines. The glyphs were ancient, far older than the Imperium, older even than the earliest Mechanicus records. "They were here," one of the tech priests muttered, his voice barely audible over the distant hum. "But they are not human." Vitus rose to his feet, his mind racing. "They never were," he said, his voice cold and distant. "What we are dealing with here is beyond the Omnissiah's reach. The forges, they belong to something else, something far older." Before he could elaborate, a sudden tremor ran through the ground beneath their feet. It was faint at first, like the ripple of water across a pond, but it grew in intensity. The tech priests fumbled with their equipment, and the Vox crackled to life, bringing a burst of static. And then, in the midst of the chaos, the ground erupted. A great maw split open beneath them, revealing a dark pit that seemed to spiral down into the heart of the planet. From the depths came a sound, low and guttural, like the grinding of ancient gears. The air was thick with the smell of burning metal and decay. "Fall back!" Vitus shouted, but his command was swallowed by the rising noise. Something was emerging from the depths of Var 9, something vast, ancient, and hungry. The ground beneath them shook violently, throwing them off balance. And then, as the first of the monstrous shapes began to rise, the lights on the canticle of ash flickered and died, leaving them in darkness. The only sound was the growl of the thing emerging from the depths, and the distant, resonating thrum that had led them here in the first place. Vitus raised his hand, the litany of the Omnissiah slipping from his lips in a futile attempt to stave off the terror clawing at the edges of his mind. It was too late. The crimson engines had awoken. The darkness pressed in around them as the maw widened, its edges jagged and uneven, like the mouth of some ancient beast long forgotten by time. The ground shuddered beneath their boots as the sound of grinding, of vast mechanisms shifting, reverberated through the very air. The thrum that had once been a faint, distant heartbeat now surged like a wave, rising and falling in time with the tremors. It wasn't just the ground that quaked, it was the very soul of the planet, alive and writhing in its own monstrous rhythm. "Move!" Vitus shouted, his voice barely rising above the roar. His hands shook as he activated his auspex, trying to force the readings into coherence, but all he saw were chaotic spikes, unholy patterns, impossible calculations. The machine god's clarity eluded him, as though the very fabric of the world had been torn asunder. His thoughts raced, but they could not keep up with the nightmare unfolding before him. From the widening fissure, something emerged, tall, shifting in the red glow of the planet's unnatural pulse. It was too large to be comprehended, a twisted amalgamation of metal, bone, and organic matter, like a colossus forged by the hands of some eldritch entity. The massive construct lumbered forward, dragging with it a trail of what could only be described as a liquid blackened by decay, oozing from the seams of its body. It moved with a terrifying inevitability, its limbs jointed in unnatural angles, as though the laws of biology had been rewritten in this place. "By the Omnissiah, what is that?" The voice of Captain Dalis was thick with disbelief. His bolter raised, but aimed uncertainly at the rising Titan. His eyes were wide, but they lacked the understanding of the threat before them. This was no simple Xenos threat. This was something far worse, something that had been crafted by the hands of ancient gods long erased from history. Vitus's mind raced as he tried to understand what he was seeing. It wasn't just the shape of the machine. It was the way it pulsed with life, the way its body seemed to grow and shift in real time, as if the very substance of the planet was feeding it, molding it into something new. The ground around them was alive, every crack in the earth resonating with a hum, the red hue growing more intense, suffocating. The air was thick with the acrid scent of burning ozone, and the heat, too intense for a planet that should be cold, was unbearable. "Fall back! Fall back to the ship," Vitus barked, his voice breaking through the panic that had begun to rise in his throat. But even as he gave the order, he knew it was too late. The thing before them was not some aberrant machine. It was a god machine, a hybrid of flesh and technology born from a forgotten age. The Adeptus Mechanicus had never recorded such a monstrosity, and Vitus had never felt so small in the face of it. As if to mock their attempts at retreat, the moor behind them shifted again, sending waves of soil and stone crashing into the air. A second form emerged from the depths, smaller but no less monstrous, its limbs elongated and shifting unnaturally, and its skin, a mix of synthetic metal and corrupt organic matter, was slick with the same vile black fluid. It skittered forward with alarming speed, its eyes locked on Vitus, as if it had been waiting for his arrival. The sound of bolter fire shattered the stillness, but the rounds ricocheted harmlessly off the surface of the monstrosity, leaving no mark. One by one the guardsmen opened fire, but their weapons had no effect. The creatures were impervious to the might of the Imperium's finest. "Magos, what do we do?" Dalis asked, his voice desperate, his hands shaking as he fumbled for his Vox helmet. Vitus's mind raced, but the clarity he sought eluded him. His gaze turned upward, searching the skies, but the canticle of ash was already a faint shape against the crimson horizon. It was too far. They were alone. Alone in this cursed place. And then, as if the planet itself had heard his thoughts, the ground shuddered again, and the moor began to close, sealing the creatures within. The giant machine paused, its massive form towering above them, its strange, burning eyes staring into Vitus as if it recognized him, acknowledged him as a part of its design. The humming of the engines grew louder, and for a brief moment the world seemed to tilt, the light bending unnaturally around them. Suddenly, the air cracked with an unearthly sound. A deep, guttural voice boomed, not from any one creature, but from the very planet itself. The words were indecipherable, but they echoed with an authority older than the Imperium, older than the machine god. They were a command, an invitation. Vitus felt it in his bones, a calling he could neither deny nor understand. "By the Omnissiah," Vitus whispered, though the words felt hollow in his mouth. The God Emperor had no answer for this. No sanctified litanies, no prayers could withstand this. This was not heresy. It was something worse, something far older. The air vibrated with the sound of the voice as it spoke once more, and as it did, Vitus's augmetic eye flickered, and the transmission from the forge ship crackled back to life. It was not a voice, but a series of images, flashes of an ancient ritual, symbols he could not comprehend, faces twisted in agony, and the sight of the engine that had birthed this planet's horror. "We are the engine." The words slipped through the air like a poison. "We are eternal." And then, as the ground shifted beneath them once again, the moor closed fully, sealing them in the heart of the forge, in the heart of something far beyond the reach of the Imperium. Vitus was not sure if it was the planet speaking, or if it was the machine god's voice coming to him for the first time. But as the world around him crumbled, he understood. This was no longer about survival. This was about the end, and they were the last to witness it. The ground beneath them settled, but the air remained thick with the same tension that had first gripped the team upon landing. They were trapped in the belly of the planet, surrounded by the throbbing pulse of the engine's heart. A low hum vibrated through the walls, an ever-present reminder that they were no longer in control of their fate. The maw that had swallowed the monsters closed behind them with an unsettling finality, sealing them off from any hope of retreat. The canticle of ash was nothing more than a distant memory now, an impossible hope in a world that seemed to bend all reality to its will. Vitus's mind raced. His heart pounded in his chest, but it wasn't just fear that gripped him. It was something deeper. He had always served the Omnissiah with a firm belief in the sacred mechanics of the universe, in the unyielding laws of the machine god. But this was something else. This was not a machine. This was a nightmare made real. "Magos, what do we do now?" Captain Daelus's voice was strained, his bolter still aimed at the slowly closing maw. There was a quiver in his words. Fear, yes, but something else too. The uncertainty of facing a force beyond their comprehension. Vitus remained silent, his mind racing. He could feel the whisper of the Omnissiah in the back of his mind, but it was faint and broken. There was no divine clarity here, only the gnawing sensation that they had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. "We move forward," Vitus said at last, his voice flat, determined. The words sounded hollow, even to him, but it was the only choice. They had no way of leaving, no way of calling for help. The forces they had encountered were beyond any comprehension of human and machine alike. The deeper they ventured, the more the temperature seemed to rise, and the further the oppressive hum grew, until it seemed to vibrate not only through the walls, but through their very bones. The metal underfoot had become slick with an oily substance, black and thick, pooling in the cracks between the flooring plates. It stank of decay, death, not just of flesh, but of something older, something primal. Every step they took was met with strange, creaking noises, as if the walls themselves were shifting, realigning. The further they moved into the bowels of this labyrinthine structure, the more impossible it became to tell what was machine and what was organic. The two had melded together in a grotesque fusion that defied any attempt to separate them. Here, in this place, there were no clean lines, no distinctions. Vitus's augmetic eye scanned the surroundings, trying to find something, anything, that could give him a clue as to what was happening. But the readings it offered were fragmented, distorted. The walls stretched out before him in ways that no structure should. The air hummed with an unfamiliar resonance that twisted his senses, making him question the solidity of the floor beneath his feet. The walls seemed to breathe, slowly, deliberately, as if the forge ship itself was alive. "Magos!" a voice crackled over the vox. It was one of the tech priests, his voice distorted by interference. "The machines, they're changing. They are not just reacting, they are evolving." Vitus turned to the source of the voice. "What do you mean, evolving?" "Look." The tech priest's servos whirred as he gestured to a nearby wall. Vitus stepped forward, and for a moment he was unsure of what he was seeing. The wall seemed to pulse. No, throb. The blackened veins that had once appeared to be nothing more than twisted, corroded cables were now moving, writhing under the surface like some form of terrible life. Vitus's breath caught in his throat. "By the Omnissiah," he whispered, but the words felt inadequate, as if the machine god himself had been rendered mute in the face of whatever was unfolding here. Suddenly, the thrumming noise escalated, a low rumble that grew louder with each passing second, vibrating through the metal walls until it was a deafening roar. The floor buckled beneath them, throwing the team to their knees. A high-pitched screech pierced the air, metal grinding against metal in a way that made the bones in their bodies rattle with the force. And then, as if in response to their presence, the walls around them began to shift, pulling apart like flesh torn by invisible hands. A vast chamber opened before them, an altar to some unspeakable entity, towering and alive with its own terrible energy. The very air shimmered, as if they were standing at the threshold of something otherworldly. And within that chamber, suspended in a pulsating mass of flesh and metal, lay the heart of the machine, the Crimson Engine. It was not a thing of steel and wires, but a living construct, as if the very essence of the planet had been poured into it, fused with the blood of the forgotten regiments that had once been sacrificed here. It beat in time with the hum of the forge, each pulse sending a tremor through the ground, each thrum carrying the weight of untold generations of death. A shape moved within the chamber, a figure that was part man, part machine, part nightmare. Its face, if it could be called a face, was a horrific mask of ancient metal and flesh, eyes glowing with an unnatural light. It regarded them with cold, unblinking certainty, as if it had been waiting for their arrival for millennia. The figure raised a hand, its fingers long and spindly, as if woven from the very wires that made up the engine. It gestured to the heart, and the walls shuddered once more, as if to say, "This is what you were always meant to find." Vitus's heart raced. The machine god was silent now, his presence nothing more than a flicker in the dark. They had crossed into the realm of something far older, far darker than any records of the Imperium could account for. Here, in the shadow of the Crimson Engine, there was only one truth. They had come to the end, and it was waiting for them. The silence that followed was thick and suffocating, broken only by the soft hum of the engine and the echo of their breathing. Vitus stood frozen, his gaze locked on the figure before them, his mind struggling to comprehend what lay in front of him. The chamber itself seemed to breathe, the walls shifting subtly, as if the entire place were alive. The pulsating light from the Crimson Engine bathed everything in a sickly red hue, casting long, twisted shadows across the floor. The figure, half man, half machine, stirred. Its movement was slow, deliberate, each step calculated and measured as though it had walked this path countless times before. Vitus could feel its presence in his chest, an oppressive weight that seemed to press down on his very soul. It was not human, not even machine in the traditional sense. It was something far older, something beyond the reach of the Omnissiah's teachings. Magos! Daelus's voice cracked through the tension, but there was no question in his tone, only the soft, tremulous sound of disbelief. What is it? What is that thing? Vitus didn't answer immediately. His mind spun, racing to piece together the impossible puzzle in front of him. The legends spoke of such beings, ancient, forgotten entities that had once ruled over the stars, their power drawn from the very heart of the universe. They were said to be creatures of both flesh and metal, born from the raw forces of the warp, and wielding the terrifying ability to reshape reality itself. But they were only myths, stories passed down through the ages to warn of the dangers lurking beyond the veil of the Imperium's reach, nothing more. And yet here it stood, staring back at them with eyes that glowed like molten gold, its form shifting and writhing as though it were caught between realities. The figure spoke, its voice low and resonant, but it wasn't words that formed from its lips. No, it was a song. A haunting, guttural chant that reverberated through the chamber, seeming to penetrate into the very marrow of their bones. The sound was more than just noise. It was something deeper, something older than language itself, a language of ritual and power. To awaken the Crimson Engines is to embrace the end, the figure intoned, its voice carrying a weight that seemed to press down on them like a crushing tidal wave. To feed the engine is to fuel the eternity of the void. You are the final offering, the last sacrifice. Vitus's heart stopped for a moment as the words sank in. The engine. It wasn't just an artifact. It was alive, and it was waiting for them. Without thinking, Vitus reached for his Vox beacon, but the signal was weak. Too weak to send a distress call. A rising panic gripped him as he realized that they were truly alone, surrounded by this nightmare without hope of escape. The ship was lost. The men were lost. And now they were at the mercy of something that defied all logic, all reason. Magos, Dalis whispered, his voice trembling. What do we do? Vitus's mind raced, but for all the years he had spent in the service of the Omnissiah, for all the knowledge he had accumulated, he had no answers. They were facing something beyond the reach of the Imperium, something that had no place in their universe, no place in their understanding of reality. The figure before them stepped forward, its limbs unnaturally long, stretching as though it were both human and something more. As it moved, the walls around them seemed to respond, closing in, reshaping, to create a tight, inescapable circle. The air grew thicker, hotter, the scent of decay and rot choking the life out of their lungs. The thing reached out, its long fingers brushing the surface of the crimson engine, and the entire chamber responded. The air hummed with power, and the engine pulsed in time with its movements, as though it was feeding off the contact. No, Vitus breathed, a chill running down his spine. This is no machine. This is a god. The figure turned its gaze toward him, its molten eyes burning with a strange, ethereal light. The recognition in its eyes sent a shock of dread through Vitus's chest, as though it had known him, recognized him in some distant, forgotten way. Not a god, the figure said, its voice filling the chamber with an impossible clarity. Not anymore. But we are what you are meant to become. The words pierced through Vitus like a spear. He had heard the liturgies, the prayers, the endless rituals of the Mechanicus, all of them chanting the same mantra, that man and machine would be one in the eyes of the Omnissiah, that the fusion of flesh and steel would lead to perfection. But this was not perfection. This was corruption, a twisting of what was once pure into something unrecognizable, something monstrous. And in that moment, Vitus understood. The crimson engine was not simply a relic. It was a weapon of transformation, a force of ascension. But it was not the ascension of the faithful, the ascension of the Omnissiah. No, this was a perversion, a horrific mockery of the sacred, a twisted path leading to something far darker than anything the Imperium had ever faced. To fuel the engine, the figure repeated, its voice now a chorus, echoing from every corner of the chamber, is to embrace the end of your kind. To fuel the engine is to feed the eternity of the void. The realization struck Vitus like a hammer. The regiments that had vanished, those who had been sacrificed to the crimson engine, were not dead. They had been consumed, transformed, twisted into something else, something new. They had become part of the machine, part of the god. And now it was their turn. Without warning, the figure moved forward, its fingers outstretched toward Vitus. It was not an attack. It was an invitation, a summons. Vitus felt the air shift around him, as though the very walls were closing in, wrapping around him like a serpent ready to strike. The power of the engine surged once more, and the chamber seemed to pulse with life, as if the entire place were alive, alive with an ancient hunger. They had crossed the threshold, and now they would be the sacrifice. Vitus recoiled instinctively as the figure's hand reached toward him. The movement was slow, deliberate, and yet there was an urgency in the air that made his every sense flare. The walls of the chamber seemed to close in tighter, the faint hum of the engine growing louder, more insistent, until it drowned out all other sound. His heart pounded in his chest, and every instinct screamed at him to run, to escape the inevitable. But his legs felt as if they were rooted to the floor, as if the very air itself held him in place. The figure's fingers brushed the surface of the crimson engine, and the room seemed to shudder in response. The air thickened, and a deep, guttural voice echoed through the chamber. The words incomprehensible, yet undeniably full of power. Vitus's augmetic eye flickered and crackled with static, distorting his vision, but even through the distortion, he could see that the engine was alive, more than a machine, more than an amalgamation of flesh and metal. It was a being, a consciousness that pulsed and breathed with the rhythm of the planet, of the warp itself. His mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. The engine wasn't just a weapon or a tool. It was a conduit, a bridge between realms, a vessel for something far older than the Imperium. A forgotten entity, perhaps even a god, that had been trapped in this forsaken place for millennia, waiting for the right moment, the right sacrifice. Vitus felt the weight of its presence pressing down on him, filling his mind with visions of the past. Long-dead regiments, their bodies twisted and fused with the machine, their screams echoing in the halls of the engine's dark sanctum. They had become part of it, just as he would, just as they all would. The figure took a step forward, its presence overwhelming. There was no escape now. The room was no longer simply a chamber. It was a trap, a living thing with its tendrils wrapped around them. The walls, the floor, the ceiling, all of it pulsed with the same sickly energy as the engine. The very fabric of the place seemed to be alive, shifting in response to their presence, as though it had been waiting for them, prepared for their arrival. Vitus took a step back, his mind struggling to hold on to the last threads of his sanity. We must destroy it, he murmured, though he knew it was a futile thought. The idea of destroying the engine seemed absurd, a child's fantasy in the face of this horror. They were nothing here, nothing but fuel, and the engine's insatiable hunger would never be satisfied. Daelus's voice was shaky as he spoke, breaking the silence that had settled like a heavy fog. How do we fight something like this, Magos? What is it? Vitus turned toward him, his mind a swirling mass of confusion and dread. It is the end, he said, his voice hollow. The end of us, the end of the Imperium. It's not a machine we're dealing with, but a living, breathing thing, and it feeds on death. The figure before them moved again, its limbs shifting unnaturally, stretching and bending in ways that no human body should. Its form seemed to melt and reform, an ever-changing nightmare of flesh and metal. It looked down at them with eyes that burned with an unnatural glow, and for a moment, Vitus could swear he saw a flash of recognition in those eyes, an understanding, a knowledge of who they were, of their place in this dark ritual. And then the figure spoke once more, its voice like the grinding of ancient gears. You are the final offering. The words echoed through the chamber, reverberating off the walls, the floor, the ceiling. The engine's hum grew louder, its resonance vibrating through the very air around them. The walls began to shift once more, the metallic surface buckling and warping like flesh under pressure. The floor beneath them cracked, and from the seams, more of the black, viscous substance began to seep, pooling around their feet. It was as though the very floor were alive, pulsating with an insatiable need. Vitus's mind snapped back into focus as the air grew heavier, the scent of decay growing stronger. He could feel the engine's presence now, not just around him but inside him, its power reaching out, probing, testing. It was calling to him, pulling at something deep inside him, something he didn't understand. The augmetic eye in his skull twitched again, sending erratic readings to his mind, and for a split second, he saw something. Saw the warp bending around the engine, the reality itself distorting as the fabric of time and space folded in on itself. It was a vision of the end, of everything falling apart. He shook his head violently, breaking the vision, and turned toward Daelus. His mind had already begun to formulate a plan, but it was a desperate, hopeless one. We have to stop it now, he said, his voice low but resolute. We destroy the heart, or we all become part of it. The captain nodded, his face pale. What do we need to do? Vitus didn't answer immediately. There were no words for what needed to happen next. He could feel it, the engine's hunger, the way it pulsed with a force that was almost alive in its own right. It wasn't enough to destroy the engine. No, that was a farce. The only way to stop it would be to sever the connection between the flesh and the machine, to break the link between the warp and the material realm. But that would mean one thing: sacrifice. The weight of that truth hung over him like a crushing burden. There was no way out, not for him, not for the others. They would be the final fuel for the engine's eternal fire. A tremor ran through the chamber as the figure before them moved again, its long, spindly fingers reaching out once more. But this time, it was different. There was no invitation in its motion now. There was only the promise of the end. And as its fingers brushed against Vitus's chest, he felt it. Something deep inside him cracked. His mind exploded with visions, flashes of horrific images. The engine's hunger, its endless cycle of death and rebirth, its insatiable need for flesh. He could feel the truth of it now, the darkness that had awaited them all. The sacrifice was inevitable. It was all that was left. As his vision blurred, as the last of his strength drained away, Vitus realized that they had already lost. The engine had won, and all that remained was the end. The figure's fingers sank into Vitus's chest, and a pulse of unnatural energy surged through him. It wasn't pain, at least not in the way he had expected. It was something far worse. The sensation was as though his very soul were being torn from his body, stretched thin, pulled apart by invisible hands. His vision swam, warping as if the very reality around him had begun to fold in on itself. He gasped, choking on the air thick with the stench of decay, the heavy hum of the engine pressing in from all sides. The walls of the chamber had become a blur, no longer solid but rippling like water. His augmetic eye flickered violently, sending broken fragments of data to his mind. Images of long-forgotten war zones, dying regiments, the screams of men and women lost to the warp, and worse still, the grotesque fusion of human and machine. They had all become part of it. "Magos!" Daelus's voice came through the haze, sharp with panic. But even his words seemed muffled, as if they were being drowned out by the engine's relentless deafening pulse. Vitus tried to turn toward him, but his body refused to obey. His limbs were heavy, lifeless. The world around him seemed to contract, the pressure of the engine's power tightening like a vice. "Fight it, Magos!" Daelus called again, but his voice was fading, becoming distant, as though coming from a place far away. Vitus felt his thoughts scatter. His mind was breaking, splintering under the weight of the engine's influence. He could feel the life force draining from him, seeping into the very walls of this accursed place. He had no control, no way to stop it. In a final, desperate attempt to break free, he reached out, his hand finding purchase on the cold metal surface of the wall. The touch sent another shock of energy through him, but this time, something changed. A flicker of recognition, an idea, seemed to surface from the depths of his consciousness. He could see it now, the heart of the engine. The crimson glow pulsed at the center of the chamber, beating like the heart of some massive beast. It was alive in a way he could no longer comprehend, and yet there was a pattern to it, a rhythm to its terrible, eternal dance. It wasn't just a machine, it was a living entity, one that fed on death, that absorbed the life force of every soul it consumed, drawing power from the souls of the lost. The realization hit him like a hammer blow. This was the key. The engine had no true power without its sacrifice. It needed death, pain, suffering, to fuel its endless cycle. But it also needed something else, something pure, something that could awaken it to its full potential. Vitus's mind screamed in protest, but the words came unbidden. "You are the fuel. You are the last sacrifice." "Magos!" Daelus shouted again, his voice desperate now, the panic rising in his tone. "We can still fight this. We can still destroy it." But Vitus could see the truth now. There was no fighting this. The engine was beyond destruction. It was beyond comprehension. It had already won, and they were nothing more than the last offering to feed its hunger. His vision darkened again, the edges of his sight blurring. But through the haze, he saw the figure moving toward him once more. The terrible molten eyes locked onto his, the same recognition in its gaze as before. It reached out, its touch cold and heavy. And as it did, Vitus felt something shift deep within him. Something ancient, something terrifying. The engine was calling to him, pulling at him, and the weight of its hunger threatened to overwhelm him completely. The figure's voice cut through the darkness, smooth and cold, like the whisper of death itself. You understand now. You are the final piece. Vitus wanted to scream, but the words caught in his throat, choked by the overwhelming power of the engine's pull. His body moved of its own accord, rising from the ground, his limbs no longer his own. He had no control. He was becoming part of it, becoming part of the endless cycle. The figure stepped closer, its presence looming over him. The engine's pulse quickened, its hum rising in intensity, filling the air with an unbearable weight. Everything around them seemed to bend and stretch, as if the very fabric of the universe were being pulled into the maw of the engine. Magos! Daelus's voice was a distant echo, but it no longer mattered. Vitus was beyond reach. He was beyond salvation. The figure's long fingers closed around his wrist, and the contact sent a jolt of raw power through him. His vision exploded in a flood of red light. The engine's hum became deafening, and in that moment he realized something. This was not the end. This was the beginning. The last vestige of his consciousness screamed as his body was pulled forward, into the heart of the engine. The walls of the chamber seemed to dissolve around him, and the pulse of the engine enveloped him completely, filling every part of his being. And then, as his mind was consumed by the dark, all-consuming power of the engine, he understood. He wasn't just a sacrifice. He was the final piece in a greater design, one that stretched across time and space, beyond the understanding of the Imperium or any mortal mind. The engine had awoken, and the galaxy would burn in its wake. The last flicker of Vitus's awareness was swallowed up, and the engine pulsed once more, its hunger insatiable. And with that, the world fell silent. The silence that followed was suffocating. The chamber, once alive with the hum of the engine and the steady pulse of the unnatural power, had now fallen eerily still. But it wasn't a peaceful stillness. No. It was the kind of silence that filled every corner of the room with the promise of something worse to come. Vitus's consciousness had been swallowed whole by the engine, but even in the depths of that oblivion, his senses remained, faint and broken. He was no longer in his body, no longer Magos Explorator Vitus. He was part of the engine now, a cog in its eternal, unspeakable machine. His thoughts, what was left of them, were adrift, caught between realities, twisted and stretched. He could feel the pull of the warp, the suffocating, oppressive force that surrounded the engine, that bound it to this world and to the next. It was as if the very fabric of space had been torn open, allowing something other to leak through. There was no escape. The others, Daelus, the remaining guardsmen, the tech priests, they were all lost now, their fates sealed by the hunger of the engine. Vitus had seen it in their eyes before they had fallen into the same trap he now faced. They had been marked for sacrifice, just as he had. They were nothing more than fuel for this unholy power. Through the haze of his fragmented thoughts, he could hear their voices now, faint, distant echoes, but still there. The cries of the lost regiments that had been consumed before him, their screams woven into the very pulse of the engine, their bodies, their minds, their souls, all absorbed into the unending hunger. He was no different now. The process was slow, agonizing, but inevitable. His body was no longer his own. It was part of the machinery, a conduit for the engine's power. He could feel the cold steel and the warm, viscous substance that oozed from its cracks, binding his flesh to it. The lines between man and machine, between the material and the immaterial, had blurred beyond recognition. He was becoming it. And yet, even in this hellish state, there was still a part of him that clung to the fragments of his will, the impulse to survive, to resist, to fight. But there was nothing left to fight against. The engine was beyond comprehension, beyond resistance. It was everything, and it was nothing. It was a god, and it was a curse. Suddenly, the ground beneath him trembled. A low rumble shook the chamber, a resonance that reverberated through the walls, through the floor, through his very bones. It was the engine. It was awakening further, growing stronger, feeding on the sacrifices of the lost. Vitus felt it in the core of his being. It was expanding, reaching out, pulling more from the void. The warp crackled with power, and the ground beneath him split open once more, a tear in reality itself. The engine's hunger was far from satisfied. The pulse of energy surged again, filling the chamber with an unbearable pressure. He could feel it clawing at his very soul, stretching it thin, pulling it apart piece by piece. His vision, such as it was, flickered. The walls twisted and writhed, the air thick with heat and decay. It was as though the very world around him was being consumed, broken down, absorbed into the engine's insatiable maw. And then the chamber shifted. The walls collapsed inward, folding in on themselves, as if the entire structure was being drawn into the heart of the engine. The space seemed to warp and twist, folding reality itself as the engine's power expanded outward, reaching toward the edges of the galaxy. Vitus's body, or what was left of it, screamed in silent agony as he was torn further into the warp. The agony was unbearable, but it was not physical. It was something deeper, something beyond the realm of pain as he had known it. It was the terror of being consumed, of losing all that he had ever been, all that had made him human. He felt the shift, felt it deep within himself. The engine was no longer just a machine. It had become something more, something that transcended the physical plane. The lines between the material and the immaterial had dissolved entirely. The engine was feeding, not just on the bodies of the sacrificed, but on everything. The warp bled into the reality of the Imperium, and soon it would spread. The power of the Crimson Engine would spread, until nothing was left but ash and whispers. For a fleeting moment, Vitus's mind, what was left of it, could grasp the enormity of what had been unleashed. The engine was not a weapon, it was a gateway. A door to the infinite, to the abyss, to the end of all things. And now, it was open. As his consciousness slipped further into the void, there was a final, desperate thought that flared in his mind. Was this the end of humanity, or was this just the beginning? And then there was only the pulse of the engine, endless and eternal, filling the void with its terrible, insatiable hunger. The silence that followed was far worse than anything that had come before. The dark hunger of the engine spread, leaving only the faintest traces of what had once been. The galaxy had begun its descent into oblivion. The chamber was still, suffocating in its silence. The once vibrant hum of the engine had faded, leaving behind an oppressive calm that hung thick in the air. There was no sound now, no pulse, no echo of the power that had filled the space moments before. It was as though the entire world had held its breath, waiting for something that would never come. Vitus's consciousness, what little remained of it, struggled to find clarity in the suffocating void. He could still feel the presence of the engine, an omnipresent force that thrummed in the core of his being. His senses were warped, fragmented. The boundaries of his mind were dissolving into something vast, something beyond comprehension. He could still hear faint whispers, distant and distorted, reverberating in his mind. They were like the last echoes of the souls that had been consumed, their screams now merged with the endless hum of the engine. The sacrifice had been made, the ritual complete, but the hunger had not subsided. It never would. The walls of the chamber seemed to pulse, the very metal bending and warping as if responding to the same ancient call. Vitus had once thought of the engine as a creation, a machine that could be understood, analyzed. But now he understood, truly understood, that it was not a machine. It was a living, breathing entity, a sentient force that transcended time and space. It existed beyond the constraints of the physical world, a conduit for something ancient, something unfathomable. It was both alive and dead, both machine and God, and it was reaching outward, expanding into the fabric of reality. The very air around him felt different now. It was thick, suffused with a strange energy that seemed to warp his perception. The lights, once steady and consistent, flickered in rhythm with the pulse of the engine. But it was not just the lights, the very air, the ground beneath him. The walls themselves all seemed to bend and twist, as though the reality they had once known was unraveling, piece by piece. This is not the end, Vitus realized. It's the beginning. The engine was not a singular entity. It was a part of something far greater, something beyond the comprehension of mortal minds. It had always been part of a greater plan, a cosmic design that had been set in motion long before humanity had even begun to dream of the stars. And now, the engine had opened a door to the infinite, a door to the warp, to a place where the rules of time and space no longer applied. As he drifted in the darkness, a sudden awareness filled his mind, and the memories of the lost regiments came flooding back. He saw their faces, their twisted bodies, their eyes empty and devoid of hope. They had been consumed by the engine, just as he had been, but their fates were not unique. The engine had been feeding on them for millennia, and it would continue to do so. It was a cycle, an eternal cycle of sacrifice and consumption that would never end. The souls of those who had been sacrificed had not died. They had been absorbed, transformed into something new, something that would continue to feed the engine's hunger. And now, it was his turn. The reality around him blurred once more, and Vitus felt himself being drawn deeper into the heart of the engine. His mind screamed, but there was no sound. His body, what was left of it, moved as though it were no longer his own. He was being consumed, piece by piece, mind and soul, until there was nothing left but the pulse of the engine, the eternal hum that filled the void. The whispers grew louder, voices rising in a chorus of madness. They were calling to him, beckoning him to join them in the depths of the engine. He could feel them, feel the lost souls of those who had come before him, grasping at him, pulling him into the endless blackness. And then, suddenly, he understood. The engine was not just consuming them, it was transforming them, turning them into part of its vast, unfathomable power. It was rewriting their very essence, blending them with the warp, fusing their minds with its own. They were becoming part of something greater, something beyond the stars, beyond the Imperium, beyond the understanding of any being that had ever existed. In the distance, he saw a faint light, an impossible light that seemed to shimmer and pulse, with an energy that was both familiar and alien. It was the gateway, the threshold that separated the material world from the warp, and it was calling to him. As he drifted closer, the voices of the lost grew louder, their cries now a symphony of despair. They were reaching out, urging him forward, pushing him toward the light. The fear that had once gripped him faded into nothingness, replaced by something else, something that could only be described as acceptance. This was his fate. This was the price of the engine's power. And then, as the light enveloped him, Vitus understood that there was no escape. The warp had already claimed him, just as it had claimed all those before him. He was part of it now, a part of the eternal hunger, a part of the endless cycle that would continue long after his mind had dissolved into the nothingness of the warp. In that final moment, he felt the power of the engine surge through him, and he became one with it. His mind, his soul, his very being were consumed. swallowed by the vast, infinite maw that stretched beyond the boundaries of reality. And the cycle continued. The light, the impossible light, surrounded him, swallowing him whole, and for a moment, there was nothing but the raw, overwhelming sensation of being drawn into something far beyond the realms of mortal understanding. Vitus's mind, fractured and distorted, could no longer grasp the boundaries between himself and the vast force that had claimed him. His thoughts were no longer his own. They were fragments, scattered echoes, whispers lost in the cold expanse of the warp. He could feel the tendrils of the engine wrapping around him, pulling him deeper into its infinite maw. There was no resistance. There was no escape. His very essence was being absorbed, reshaped, and repurposed for something far greater, something far older than anything he had ever known. It was as if the laws of reality themselves had ceased to matter, replaced by an insatiable hunger, a hunger that spread out, reaching beyond the confines of the chamber, beyond Var 9, beyond even the stars themselves. This wasn't just a machine. It was a god whose hunger could never be satisfied, whose power could never be quenched. The voices of the lost regiments filled his mind now, echoes of the past, voices twisted and broken by time and suffering. They were not silent. They never would be. Their cries were woven into the very fabric of the warp, their souls forever part of the engine's endless cycle. And now, as he felt his mind unraveling, as his body was consumed, he realized that he was becoming one of them. His soul, a tiny, flickering fragment within the endless void, trapped forever in the cold, dark belly of the engine. And yet, in the midst of this all-encompassing void, something shifted. There was a tug, a pull at the edge of his consciousness, a faint flicker of awareness. It was almost imperceptible at first, like a whisper in the wind, but it grew stronger with every passing moment. It was a voice. No, not a voice, a presence, something, stirring in the depths of the warp, something alive, something familiar. Vitus tried to reach out, tried to grasp at it, but his body was no longer his own. It was as if his very existence had become a tool, a vessel for something far greater. And yet, that presence, so faint and distant, remained. It was a thread of hope, however small, however fragile. The presence pushed back against the engine's influence. It was a force, ancient and alien, but one that seemed to recognize him. It tugged at him, beckoning him to follow, urging him to resist. For the first time since his transformation into the engine's vessel, a fleeting thought of defiance sparked within him. Could he fight back? Could he break free from the engine's grasp? The whispers around him grew more frantic, their tones frantic, angry, filled with desperation. The lost souls that had been consumed by the engine before him were now aware of his struggle. They were screaming, not in agony, but in rage. They did not want him to escape. They could not understand why he was resisting. They had accepted the engine, embraced its eternal cycle, and they demanded that he do the same. But Vitus, he was different. His mind, though broken, though fading, was not fully consumed. The presence, faint and almost imperceptible, continued to pull him. It was a force beyond the warp, beyond the engine, a beacon of something long lost. With a final, desperate push, Vitus reached toward it, and in that moment, everything stopped. The pulsing, the hum, the hunger of the engine, it all ceased. For the briefest of moments, the warp itself fell silent. Vitus's mind reeled, not understanding what was happening, not understanding how or why. But as the silence stretched on, it was clear that something was happening. The presence had shifted, moved from the depths of the warp and found its way to him. It was no longer a faint whisper, but a force, powerful, pure, and it was pushing against the engine's overwhelming influence. For the first time, Vitus felt the weight of the warp lift. He could feel the pressure against his mind, the crushing force of the engine's influence, begin to recede. It was like a floodgate opening, letting in fresh air after a lifetime of suffocation. The engine's hold on him faltered, wavered, as if it too felt the presence pushing against it. And then, something truly unimaginable happened. The engine screamed. It was not a noise, it was a resonance, a vibration of pure, unrestrained energy, so powerful that it rattled the very bones of the planet. The chamber around Vitus cracked, the walls buckling and splintering as if they were made of brittle glass. The very fabric of reality seemed to warp, twisting under the strain of the conflicting forces that now raged within it. The engine, the god machine, was fighting back. The presence that had helped him was not content to merely push it aside. It was tearing into the very heart of the engine, unraveling the core of its power. The warp itself seemed to bend in unnatural ways, pulling in upon itself, collapsing into a singularity of pure, unrestrained force. Vitus could feel it. His mind, his consciousness, was no longer his own. He was both part of the engine and yet separate from it. His body was ripping apart, being consumed, pulled into the heart of the storm. But even as he felt himself disintegrating, there was no fear, only purpose, only defiance. The engine's scream intensified, now a guttural, raw roar of pure agony. The warp trembled, twisted, and distorted as the forces of the ancient presence tore into the god machine, unraveling it from the inside out. The sound, if it could be called sound, was deafening, a shrill, bone-shaking wail that seemed to last an eternity. And then, with a final resounding crack, the engine broke. Reality, as it had been known, shattered. The chamber collapsed into nothingness, and in its wake, all that remained was the final echo of the engine's cry, fading into the darkness. The universe itself seemed to pause in the wake of the engine's destruction. The relentless pulse that had once filled the chamber, that had bound them all to the dark heart of the warp, was gone, vanished like smoke on a windless night. The crushing force, the suffocating pressure that had borne down on Vitus's mind, had lifted. The screams of the lost souls had faded into silence, and with it, the oppressive, gnawing hunger of the engine. For a brief, impossible moment, there was peace. But peace in this forsaken place was fleeting. Vitus, or what remained of him, floated in the void. His body was no longer bound by flesh. His mind, once shattered and scattered, was a fragmented echo of what it had been. He was not dead, not fully, but nor was he alive in any meaningful sense. He was caught between worlds, between realities, hanging on the edge of existence like a threadbare wisp of smoke. Around him, the remnants of the engine's power pulsed faintly, a dying heartbeat struggling to remain in the physical realm. The walls that had once pressed in on him now crumbled, disintegrating into the darkness like decaying remnants of a long-forgotten structure. The light, if it could be called that, had dimmed to a faint red glow, its source now completely indistinguishable from the void that had swallowed it. Vitus was conscious of his thoughts, of the lingering fragments of his mind trying desperately to hold on to something. He had witnessed the engine's collapse, felt its terrible power unraveling, but now, there was only the lingering sensation of its presence, fading like a nightmare slipping away with the morning light. Yet, even in this fractured state, Vitus could not shake the feeling that something was still watching, still waiting. The engine may have broken, but the darkness it had unleashed was far from finished. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the edges of his vision began to sharpen. The cold, infinite blackness around him receded, revealing shapes, flickering lights, strange shadows. There was something here, something beyond the fabric of the warp, a presence. He had felt it before, but now it was more distinct, more real. It was still there. The voice that had whispered through his mind before, the presence that had guided him, it had not disappeared. It had been the catalyst for the engine's destruction, the force that had torn through its heart. But as the engine's power faded, The presence grew, solidifying into something more concrete, more defined. It was no longer a vague, beckoning force. It was something, someone. Vitus's thoughts stuttered. He felt himself pulled, like a needle threading through the fabric of space itself, tugged toward an unknown destination. The remnants of the warp seemed to swirl around him, coiling and undulating like a living entity. His body, his soul, was being pulled towards something that felt both familiar and alien. And then he saw it. A figure, standing at the center of the void. It was not human, not in the way he understood the term. It was vast, shadowy, an entity draped in swirling darkness. Its form was not solid, not entirely physical. It was an amalgamation of shadows and flickering light, a being whose very essence defied definition. Its eyes, if they could be called eyes, glowed with a strange, ethereal light, burning with an ancient wisdom that pierced the void. The figure did not speak, yet Vitus could hear its voice in his mind, clear and resonant, as though it was a part of him. "You have come far, Magos," the voice said, smooth and unyielding. "Further than any before you, further than those who would seek to stop the engine. But now, you will see the truth." Vitus could not respond, could not form words. His mind was too far gone, too fragmented to grasp the full meaning of the figure's words. But even in his broken state, he understood. This entity, whatever it was, held the answers. It was the source of the power that had guided him, the force that had pulled him through the endless dark, the one that had allowed him to break free from the engine's grasp. The figure's form shimmered, flickering like a candle in the wind, and with a slow, deliberate movement, it raised one hand toward him. The air around Vitus rippled, the fabric of reality itself warping as the figure's gesture reached into the very heart of the warp. He felt the weight of its presence, its immense power pressing down on him, suffocating him with its intensity. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure's form shifted, dissolved, and was gone. Vitus was left alone in the void, or perhaps not alone. The presence, the force that had guided him, was still there, lingering in the corners of his fractured mind. Its voice echoed again, but this time there was something else. A promise, perhaps, or a warning. He could not tell. But it was clear now that his journey was far from over. The engine had been destroyed, but its power, its influence, was far from extinguished. What remained now was something else, something deeper. And Vitus, whatever he had become, would be a part of it. As the last vestiges of the engine's power bled into the warp, Vitus felt himself drawn forward once more, into the very heart of the unknown. And as the darkness closed around him, he understood. This was not the end. It was only the beginning. Vitus drifted, caught between the pulse of the warp and the eerie emptiness of the void that surrounded him. His body, if it could still be called that, had long since become irrelevant. His consciousness, fractured and scattered like dust in a storm, grasped at fleeting thoughts, at fragments of memories that had once been his. The figure that had guided him, the one that had promised answers, had vanished. But its presence lingered, faint yet insistent, a whisper that echoed in his fractured mind. He could no longer distinguish time. The boundaries between past and present, between the physical and the immaterial, had all but dissolved. It was as though the very concept of existence itself was unraveling around him, leaving only the sensation of being pulled, constantly pulled towards something. There was no up, no down, no direction. Only the endless pull of the unknown. And then, the presence returned. Not as a figure this time, but as an overwhelming sensation. It was not a voice, not words, but a feeling, a force, something ancient, vast, unfathomable. It wrapped around him, pressing in on his mind from all directions. He felt it in his bones, in the very core of his being, as if it had always been a part of him, waiting for him to recognize it. "You have come further than any before," the presence whispered, though there were no words. The sensation wrapped around him like the weight of 1,000 lifetimes. "Further than the machine god ever intended. But you are not done yet, Magos. Your fate is tied to this place, to the engine. You are both a part of it, and yet not. The cycle continues." The words, if they could be called words, cut through him like a blade. He had once believed in the purity of the Omnissiah, in the sacredness of the machine, but now that belief seemed like nothing more than a fleeting shadow. The engine, whatever it was, had shattered his understanding of everything. He had witnessed its collapse, felt its hunger, but there was something more, something that had always been lurking beneath the surface. And it was not finished yet. It was never finished. The presence tightened around him, as though it were drawing him deeper into itself. He could feel the infinite weight of time bearing down on him. It was ancient, older than the stars themselves, and it was watching him, waiting. The remnants of the warp stirred around him, but they were not chaotic. They were ordered, controlled, as though the universe itself was being reshaped from the inside out. "You are the last of your kind," the presence murmured, a sensation of cold certainty slipping through his consciousness. "You have walked through the dark, seen the end of all things. But now you will be the vessel. You will carry the knowledge that no one should have known. You will carry the power that the engine has left behind." Vitus tried to resist, tried to fight the pull, but it was futile. His mind, what was left of it, could no longer distinguish his own thoughts from the presence that had claimed him. He could feel the power surging around him, coursing through him, a dark torrent that filled the empty spaces in his mind. It was the engine's legacy, the final echo of its endless hunger. And now it was his burden to carry. He was no longer a Magos, no longer a servant of the Omnissiah. He was something else, something greater, yet far more terrifying. And in that moment, a new understanding washed over him. He saw the shape of things to come, the threads of fate weaving themselves into a new pattern. He had thought that by destroying the engine, he had ended it, but it had never truly been destroyed. It had merely been reborn, reshaped into something new, something that could not be contained by the boundaries of the material universe. And now it was free, free to spread beyond Var 9, beyond this forgotten place, beyond the stars themselves. The presence in his mind shifted, grew more defined, as if it were reaching out, pulling something else from the depths of the warp. And with it, he felt a sharp crack, like the breaking of a great chain. The power surged within him, flooding his mind, and for the first time, he understood the true meaning of the engine's hunger. It was not simply a machine, nor a god. It was a force, an endless, eternal force that had always existed, waiting for the right moment to awaken, to spread across the universe. The universe, Vitus realized, was no longer the same. It was fracturing, tearing at the seams as the engine's power bled into the warp, spreading out like a cancer. It was too late to stop it. The cycle was already in motion. What had once been bound by the laws of time, of space, was now free to roam, untethered, unbound. And Vitus, the last Magos, was the key. He was the vessel. He was the conduit. He was the one who would carry the knowledge of the engine into the infinite dark. "The engine lives," the presence said, its voice now a deafening roar in his mind. "And now, it will awaken in places you cannot reach. It will spread beyond this world, beyond Var 9, beyond even the stars. The cycle will continue." Vitus felt his body, his soul shifting. The warp twisted around him, pulling him further into the depths of its endless hunger. The presence was no longer distant. It was inside him, entwined with every thought, every pulse of his being. There was no escape now, There was no turning back. He was the last of his kind, and the universe would never be the same. The engine had not been destroyed. It had been reborn, and now it was free. Free to spread its hunger across the stars. And Vitus, the last vessel, would carry its legacy. The universe itself felt different, as though the very fabric of reality had been warped beyond recognition. Vitus's senses, still fractured from the engine's overwhelming influence, could no longer trust the laws of space and time that had once seemed so solid. Everything had shifted, and he was caught in the heart of it, an unwilling vessel for the power of something older and darker than any force he had ever encountered. He could feel it surging through him, this newfound energy, this terrible knowledge. It was inside him now, a part of him, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't escape it. There was no light, no sound, only the sensation of being pulled, being stretched, being changed. The world, or what was left of it, seemed to bend around him, the edges of his awareness flickering like a broken signal, constantly distorting. The pull of the warp was stronger than ever, and it was no longer a distant force. It was here, it was now, and it was feeding from him, feeding on his consciousness, devouring whatever pieces of himself he still held on to. The hunger, the engine's hunger, was insatiable. But now, it was not just a force of consumption. It had become a driving purpose, a singular intent. It was not merely alive anymore. It was an awareness, a presence, one that knew what it needed to do. And it was spreading. Vitus's mind stumbled over this realization. The engine had broken, yes, but it had not ceased. It had fractured into something greater. The destruction he had witnessed was not the end. It was the beginning. He had hoped, foolishly, that the death of the machine would stop the cycle, but it hadn't. Instead, the engine had been reborn, its influence unfurling like an unholy tide, seeking to expand into the farthest reaches of the universe. He felt the weight of it, the power inside him, spreading outward. It was as though he were no longer just a man, no longer just a magos of the Adeptus Mechanicus. He was part of it now, connected to its eternal drive. His very essence had been absorbed into the warp, bound to the engine's purpose. And in this moment, as he felt the last remnants of his identity slipping away, he understood that this was not a curse. It was an inevitability. The engine was not simply a machine of metal and gears. It was a force of nature, as ancient as the stars themselves, a force that had always existed in the background of reality, waiting for the right moment to awaken. The universe had been a slumbering beast, and now it was waking. And Vitus was the herald. He had become the harbinger of something far greater than even the Emperor's might. The power of the warp surged within him, and the whispers of the lost regiments, those whose bodies had been absorbed by the engine, spoke to him once more. They were not gone, not truly. They had become part of the cycle, part of the living, breathing thing that was now reaching out to consume everything. He felt their presence, their voices merging with his own, their minds interwoven with his. They were with him now, part of him, urging him forward. There was no fear, no regret. There was only the hunger to expand, to consume, to reshape reality in its image. The power was limitless, and yet it was tied to him, to his broken soul. The presence of the engine pressed on him, demanding that he accept it, that he become it. The pain of resistance had long since faded into numbness, and now all that remained was the pull of its will, its ceaseless drive. As his mind swirled in this cosmic frenzy, Vitus saw flashes of what was to come. The warp, once a distant and terrifying thing, was no longer something separate from reality. It was becoming part of it, blending with the material world in a way that no one could have foreseen. The borders between the two were dissolving, breaking down, and soon there would be nothing left but the fusion. The universe would no longer be the same. It would be a reflection of the engine's hunger, a place where only the strong would survive, where the cycle of consumption would continue unabated. But as the vision of the future unfolded before him, a thought sparked in Vitus's mind. What if it was too late? What if the cycle was already beyond his control? What if the hunger, this endless, insatiable force, had already spread too far to be stopped? It was a thought that threatened to tear him apart, but as quickly as it came, it was swept away by the force of the engine's will. The cycle could not be stopped. The hunger could not be satisfied. And he, Vitus, was no longer a man, but a vessel, a link in the eternal chain. The last remnants of his human will screamed in protest, but it was a hollow cry, drowned out by the rising tide of power that surged through him. The presence of the engine had become part of him, and there was no going back. There was only the path ahead, the endless, eternal path of consumption. And as the darkness closed in around him, as the last shred of his identity faded into the void, he understood the truth. The engine was not just a machine. It was a force of nature, a primal hunger that would never cease, never stop. It would spread, reaching out across the universe, consuming all that it touched, until nothing remained but the emptiness, the endless hunger. He had become one with it, and now the galaxy would burn. Vitus had become part of the great, undying hunger that pulsed through the warp, but it was not a feeling of contentment, of finality. Number it was an ever-present need, a desire to consume, to reshape, to devour. The hunger was endless, the pull unyielding. His mind, what remained of it, was no longer his own, a broken fragment of humanity drowned in the relentless power of the engine. He felt himself stretched thin across realities, torn between what he had once been and what he had become. But now there was no question left. The cycle had begun, and it would never cease. The universe, which had once seemed so vast and orderly, was unraveling. The fabric of space and time bent beneath the weight of the engine's presence. Everywhere Vitus looked, he saw the scars of the warp bleeding into reality, distorting the stars, warping planets into grotesque forms, and swallowing whole worlds into the endless darkness. The engine was not a machine, it was a conduit, a gateway that allowed the insatiable hunger of the warp to break through. It was spreading, growing, and now there was nothing that could stop it. Vitus no longer understood the boundaries of existence. His mind could not comprehend the enormity of what had been unleashed. He was no longer an individual, a human with a purpose. He was the vessel through which the engine's hunger would consume all, and he felt it everywhere. The screams of those lost in the engine, their souls twisted into something unrecognizable, filled his mind. The whispers of the sacrificed regiments echoed in the void, their voices merging with his own, their fate sealed in the warp, their very essence transformed into fuel for the eternal machine. But even as the hunger spread, even as reality twisted into chaos, there was a part of him, faint, fragile, that remembered. It remembered the purpose he had once served, the sacred rituals of the Adeptus Mechanicus, the belief in the Omnissiah, the hope that he had once clung to. It was a dim memory, fading like a distant dream, but it was still there, clinging to the edges of his shattered consciousness. It was the last shred of humanity he had left. In the depths of the warp, something stirred, a presence, a force, a flicker of light in the infinite blackness. It was the very thing that had once whispered to him, guiding him toward the destruction of the engine, urging him to break free. But now it was different. The presence had become more than just a guide. It was a force unto itself, a being of unimaginable power that had been born from the very destruction it had helped to cause. It was pulling at him once more, but this time there was no comfort in its call. There was no promise of salvation. Instead, it felt like a test. The presence reached out to him, surrounding him, pulling him toward a new reality, a new form of existence. It was offering him a choice that no one else had been given. Would he continue down this path of hunger and consumption, becoming nothing more than an instrument of the engine's will? Or would he break free from its grasp, cast aside the power that now flowed through him, and try to reclaim the remnants of his humanity? But even as the presence pulled at him, even as the voices of the lost urged him forward, Vitus felt the cold weight of the engine's hunger pressing on him, a reminder that there was no escaping. It was within him, part of him now, and it would never let him go. The last vestige of his will, of his humanity, rebelled, a flicker of defiance in the darkness. For the first time, Vitus understood what was at stake. The engine's power had been unleashed, yes, but it was still a part of something greater, something that was waiting to be awakened. It was not a machine of metal and gears, but something far older, far darker. And now it was ready to spread its influence beyond the boundaries of the warp, beyond the stars themselves. The galaxy was ripe for its hunger, and Vitus was the key to unlocking its power. He felt himself being pulled, not into the embrace of the warp, but into something else, something new. The presence in the void, the force that had guided him, was not a god, nor a machine. It was the engine's true purpose, the very thing that had shaped its existence. And it was calling to him. Vitus realized then that there was no longer a choice. He was part of the engine now, and its power would never cease. The hunger would continue to spread, and there was no force in the universe that could stop it. It had already begun. And so, as the last remnants of his will faded away, swallowed by the endless hunger of the engine, Vitus understood that the galaxy had already been consumed. The endless cycle of death and rebirth had begun, and there would be no end. There was only the hunger, stretching out into eternity, devouring everything in its path. The silence returned, heavy and suffocating, as Vitus, no longer a man, no longer a magos, became the final piece in the endless puzzle. And in the depths of the warp, the engine's hum grew louder, its power reaching out to claim all that it touched. The galaxy was lost, and the hunger would never cease. Vitus's mind, if it could still be called that, twisted in the suffocating void of the warp. What was left of his consciousness was a distant echo, a fading ember caught between the fading remnants of his humanity and the all-consuming hunger of the engine. He could feel it pulsing through him, not in the way that his heart once beat, but as a cold, predatory rhythm that resonated through every fiber of his being. He had become something else now, something more, something less. There was no longer a clear boundary between himself and the engine. The boundaries of his former self had dissolved, replaced by the hollow hunger that spread like an infection, a gnawing force that pulsed within the very core of the warp. There was no escape, no salvation. And yet, somewhere deep within the swirling, chaotic sea of thought, there was a flicker of something. Faint, fragile. Was it hope? It was hard to say. Perhaps it was more a lingering memory of something once believed. In the darkest part of his being, he remembered a time when he had fought for a greater cause, when he had been driven by purpose and faith. That belief had been consumed long ago, but this fragile thread, was it a memory of something else? The presence that had guided him, that had torn through the very heart of the engine, had not vanished. It was with him still, twisting around him like a shadow, reaching out for him as though it were both a part of him and separate from him. But now, it was no longer a whisper, a distant call. It was pressing, insistent. It had grown in strength, just as the engine had, and it seemed to feed off the very destruction it had helped unleash. Vitus felt his mind fragment, unable to hold on to the remnants of his humanity. The hunger in his chest was insatiable. The cold pull of the warp twisted and reshaped his thoughts, shattering them, bending them toward one singular purpose: consumption. He could feel the power of the engine spreading outward from him, its influence slowly reaching across the universe like a tide that could not be stopped. Planets, stars, galaxies, they would all be consumed, swallowed by the insatiable hunger of the warp. There would be nothing left but the void. But still, somewhere in the distance, the figure, the presence, called to him again. It was beckoning him, urging him to move forward. It was not a command, not a plea, but a promise that he was still needed, still part of something greater. The idea was maddening. How could he still be a part of anything but this endless cycle of death? How could anything greater emerge from such devastation? Yet the presence pressed on, wrapping around his shattered mind. The whispers were no longer so distant. They were familiar, echoing in ways that made his very being tremble. These weren't the lost voices of the sacrificed regiments anymore. No, these voices were alive. They were aware. The voices of those who had once been human, like him, were no longer twisted or consumed. They had transcended. The engine's hunger, which had threatened to obliterate all that he was, had become something else, something more structured, more focused. "You see, Vitus," the presence spoke, its voice not heard but felt, woven into the very fabric of his thoughts. "The cycle is not a curse, it is a gift. The hunger, the destruction, it has a purpose. It is not an end. It is the beginning of something greater." The words cut through him like a blade, raw and sharp, yet he could not pull away. The realization that had been building inside him clicked into place. The engine had not just been a machine of destruction. It was a catalyst, a force that had awakened something ancient, something waiting to be revealed. This was not the end of humanity, nor the end of the Imperium. No, this was only the beginning. The destruction was a necessary step, a cleansing. As the presence wrapped around him tighter, drawing him closer to whatever awaited in the depths of the warp, Vitus understood the truth. The engine, the hunger, it was not a force of pure annihilation. It was a transformation. It consumed only to reshape, to build. The universe, as it was known, was a broken thing. But this new reality, forged from the ashes of the old, would be whole. It would be a thing of perfect order. The warp would merge with reality, reshaping existence into a seamless, eternal cycle of growth and consumption. And Vitus, whether he wanted to or not, would be the vessel for it. He had been chosen, not by fate, but by design. The power within him surged, and he felt it take root, spreading through him like wildfire, consuming every last trace of resistance. He had become one with the warp, one with the engine, and now he was the bridge between worlds. The hunger was no longer a force he feared. It was his. It was the driving force that would reshape the galaxy. He was part of it, a cog in the endless machine that would turn the universe into something new, something beyond life and death, beyond the limitations of the human soul. And as he was pulled deeper into the warp's embrace, a final, twisted sense of purpose washed over him. The universe would be reborn, and there would be no more pain, no more loss. The cycle would continue, but it would no longer be an endless spiral of suffering. It would be something else. It would be perfect. Vitus closed his eyes, or at least he thought he did. There was no longer a distinction between his thoughts and the presence that enveloped him. There was only the endless pulse of the warp, only the engine's hum as it reached across time and space to consume all. The final step had been taken, and with it, the future was written. The galaxy had begun its transformation, and Vitus, the last Magos, was its herald.